Hey everyone, welcome back to Mr. Not Horror. If you're ready for a story that'll give you chills, make sure to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. Now, get cozy, relax, and let's begin today's spooky tale. Mark had always been drawn to the wilderness, the isolation, the raw beauty of nature, the sense of peace that came with being far from the noise of the city. It was something he craved. So, when he stumbled upon an old, secluded cabin deep in the pine forest, he saw it as the perfect retreat from his hectic life. It was a place where he could recharge, think, and get away from everything. The cabin was run down but still sturdy, with a stone fireplace and thick wooden beams holding the roof up. It sat at the edge of a dense pine forest, a place where no one came except for the occasional hiker or fisherman passing through. Mark wasn't bothered by its age, or the fact that the property had been abandoned for years. In fact, it made the place even more intriguing. The first night was peaceful. The wind whispered through the pine trees, and Mark sat in front of the fire, enjoying the solitude. There were no modern distractions here, no phone, no Wi-Fi, just him and the wilderness. It was exactly what he needed. But as the night wore on, a strange unease settled over him. It was subtle at first, just a feeling that something wasn't right. The whispering of the wind sounded almost like voices murmuring indistinctly in the distance. He dismissed it as his imagination running wild and went to bed, the sound of the pines swaying gently outside his window, lulling him to sleep. The next morning, Mark woke up to find a heavy fog covering the ground. The air was damp and the trees loomed like dark sentinels in the mist. He stepped outside, breathing in the cool, crisp air, but the unease from the night before lingered. The forest felt different now, strange, almost alive, as if it were watching him. He shook the thought from his mind and decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear his head. As he ventured deeper into the woods, the trees grew denser, the fog thicker. The towering pines blocked out much of the light, casting the forest floor into an eerie twilight. Mark kept walking, feeling a strange pull to move further in, even though a voice in the back of his mind warned him to turn back. He ignored it. Hours passed, and Mark realized he had lost his way. The forest, with its endless rows of identical trees, seemed to stretch on forever, and he couldn't find any clear path back to the cabin. The unease he had felt earlier turned to something more palpable now, something sinister. The trees seemed to close in around him, and the wind, which had been soft before, now howled through the branches, carrying with it faint, unintelligible whispers. He called out, but his voice was swallowed by the vast, oppressive silence of the forest. The whispers continued, growing louder, until it was as if the trees themselves were speaking to him. He tried to shake off the creeping fear that had taken hold of him, telling himself it was just the wind, just the forest. But then he heard something that made his blood run cold. "Mark!" The voice was low and rasping, like the sound of dry leaves scraping against the ground. It was coming from behind him, but when he turned, there was nothing there, only the dark, twisting trees. He swallowed hard, heart pounding in his chest, and began walking faster, hoping to find his way out. But the deeper he went, the worse it got. The whispers grew louder and more insistent, calling his name over and over, as if something was beckoning him, urging him to follow. Mark's feet felt heavy, like the forest itself was trying to hold him in place. His mind raced, and he broke into a run, desperate to escape the ever-tightening grip of the forest. The fog thickened, the trees seemed to close in around him, and the whispering became deafening. The voice was no longer distant, it was right behind him, like a breath on the back of his neck. It said his name again, this time with an eerie sweetness, almost like a lullaby. "Mark, don't leave, stay with us." Mark's heart raced. He didn't know where to go or what to do. The path was gone. The forest seemed endless. The trees stretched out like twisted arms, their branches reaching toward him, beckoning him to stay. The ground beneath his feet gave way and he stumbled, falling into a small clearing. He looked around and saw something that stopped him dead in his tracks. At the center of the clearing was a large stone circle, its edges worn smooth by time. It looked ancient, out of place in the middle of the forest. The whispering was louder now, so loud it almost drowned out all other sound. And then, through the dense fog, he saw them. Figures emerged from the trees, shadows that were indistinct at first, but as they drew closer, they took shape. They were tall, gaunt, their faces twisted with strange, hollow eyes. They moved silently, gliding across the ground, their movements unnatural. They were the source of the whispering. "Stay with us," one of them whispered, its voice rasping like dry leaves, and "you belong with us." Mark's legs felt weak, his mind fogged with fear. He stumbled backward, but the figures closed in, surrounding him. He tried to run, but the clearing seemed to stretch, and the trees pressed in on him from all sides. The figures were everywhere now, their cold, lifeless hands reaching for him. "Don't fight it," another whispered. "We've been waiting for it." The trees behind them seemed to shudder as if they were alive, their roots writhing beneath the soil. Mark turned to face the figures, but all he could see were their eyes, deep, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce into his soul. His breath caught in his throat, his body frozen in place, and then they spoke in unison. "Join us, forever." The ground beneath Mark's feet trembled, and the air grew thick with an unnatural stillness. The trees closed in even tighter, their branches scratching at the sky. Mark screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the vast, empty expanse of the forest. The last thing he saw before the darkness closed in was the hollow eyes of the figures, watching him as the forest whispered his name, pulling him into its cold, endless embrace. And then there was silence. Back at the cabin, the wind howled through the trees. The fog had settled into the valley, and the pines stood still, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. No one knew that Mark had disappeared, or what had become of him. But if you listen closely, in the quiet moments when the wind rustles the trees, you might hear his name being whispered. And if you're unlucky enough to be lost in the woods, you might hear it call to you too. It was a quiet, foggy evening when Andrew first noticed him. The man in the alley, his figure barely visible through the thick mist, stood motionless under a flickering streetlight. His appearance was unremarkable, dressed in an old coat, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. But there was something wrong about him, something that Andrew couldn't quite place. The man wasn't moving, his body as still as the fog that swirled around him. Andrew had been walking home from his late shift at the diner, his mind focused on the routine of the day. He was used to the quiet streets of his small town, especially at this hour, when most people were tucked inside, away from the chill of the evening air. He was about to turn the corner, heading toward his apartment, when he saw the man. He didn't think much of it at first. Maybe the man was waiting for someone, or perhaps he was just lost in thought, as people often were in the early hours. But the longer Andrew looked at him, the more uneasy he was. There was something unnatural about the way the man stood, his posture rigid, his face hidden in the shadow of his hat. It was as if he were waiting for something. As Andrew walked closer, he glanced at the man again. Only this time, something in his peripheral vision caught his attention. The man's shadow, elongated and distorted by the flickering streetlight, was moving, shifting unnaturally across the wet pavement. The shadow stretched and writhed as though it had a life of its own, pulling away from the man's form like it was trying to escape him. A chill ran down Andrew's spine. He quickened his pace, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. But as he passed the alley, he could feel the man's presence watching him, even though the man hadn't moved. Andrew tried not to look back, but his curiosity got the better of him. He turned his head just enough to see the man standing there, still as a statue, his head tilted slightly as though he were studying Andrew. Andrew's heart thudded in his chest. It was as if the man was waiting for him to do something, waiting for him to make the first move. But Andrew wasn't sure what that move should be. Something in the man's stillness made the air around him feel suffocating, oppressive, like the world itself had stopped, frozen in time. He forced himself to look away and continued down the street. His steps hurried now. The alley grew smaller in his periphery, the man's figure swallowed by the fog. But even as he walked faster, Andrew couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still there, his gaze following him. Later that night, as Andrew lay in bed, he tried to ignore the nagging thoughts that circled his mind. He had seen strange things before, people who seemed out of place or unsettling, a stray dog that acted too aggressively. But the man in the alley was different. There was something about him that felt wrong, something that Andrew couldn't quite articulate, but which gnawed at him relentlessly. Around 3 a.m., Andrew was jolted awake by a sound, a tapping at his window. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, louder this time, a soft, rhythmic knocking. His heart raced. He got out of bed and crept toward the window, his feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. The street outside was dark and empty, just as it had been when he went to bed. The fog still clung to the ground, thick and heavy, but there was no one there, no shadow, no figure lurking in the mist, just the quiet streets. He let out a sigh of relief, but as he turned to go back to bed, something caught his eye. The faintest outline of a figure, tall, thin, and impossibly still, stood across the street, just under the light of the same street lamp. Andrew's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't see the man's face, but he could feel his presence. Cold, unsettling, like an unnatural force pressing against the very air around him. The tapping came again, louder this time. But this time, it wasn't from the window. It was coming from inside the room, from the closet. Andrew's mind raced. The sound was slow, deliberate, like fingernails scraping against the wood, or perhaps a hand gently tapping against the door. He backed away from the closet, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached for the light switch, his hand trembling as he flicked it on. But the room remained dark. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the only sound was Andrew's own breathing, shallow and ragged. His pulse thudded in his ears as he stared at the closet door, waiting for something to happen, for something to move. But nothing did. He took a hesitant step toward the closet, his hand reaching for the handle, when a voice whispered, so soft and faint that it seemed to come from the very walls themselves. "Open it." Andrew froze, the voice chilling him to his core. It was the same voice he had heard earlier, the voice of the man from the alley, but now it was inside his own home, inside his own mind. It was as if the man's presence had followed him, brought him to this place of darkness and fear. "Open it," the voice repeated, louder this time, urgent. Andrew didn't move. He couldn't. His body refused to obey the instinct to turn and flee. It was as if he were rooted to the spot, trapped in this suffocating moment, unable to escape. The closet door creaked open on its own, and what was inside wasn't human. The thing that stepped out of the closet was tall, too tall, unnaturally so, and its body was stretched and thin, like a puppet with strings pulled too tight. Its skin was pale, translucent, almost like it had been drained of life. Its limbs bent at odd angles, and its mouth hung open, stretching too wide for any person to have, revealing rows of teeth that looked more like jagged shards of glass. Its eyes were black, deep, endless voids that seemed to draw Andrew, pulling him closer with every blink. And then it smiled. A smile that didn't reach its eyes, a smile that was more a distortion of the human form than a true expression of joy. It stepped closer, its movements jerky, like a marionette being controlled by an invisible hand. The voice spoke again, but now it wasn't a whisper. It was a command, clear and sharp. "Come with me!" Andrew wanted to scream, wanted to run, but his body wouldn't respond. His muscles were frozen, his mind paralyzed with fear. The figure continued to approach him, its smile widening, its shadow stretching across the floor. Suddenly, everything went black. When Andrew woke up, the sun was shining through his bedroom window, the fog gone and the streets outside quiet once again. He sat up, confused, his heart still racing. Had it all been a dream? Had the man, the figure in the alley, been a figment of his imagination? But as he looked around the room, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A single, long fingerprint, pressed against the inside of his closet door. The mark was fresh, as if someone or something had touched it just moments before. And in the corner of the room, just barely visible, was the figure's shadow, tall and thin, watching him from the darkness. Emily had always been fascinated by old things, the kind that held history, secrets, and a certain aura of mystery. So when she found the antique mirror at the estate sale, she couldn't resist. It was large, framed in tarnished silver with intricate carvings, and had the air of something both beautiful and eerie. The moment she laid eyes on it, she knew she had to have it. The seller, an elderly woman with thin, trembling hands, warned her about the mirror as she made the purchase. "Be careful," whispered. "It has a way of showing things that aren't always real." Emily laughed off the warning. People said strange things when they were old, right? Still, as she loaded the mirror into the back of her car, a chill ran down her spine, though she couldn't explain why. When she got home, she placed it in her hallway, leaning it against the wall, not yet hung. The reflective surface was murky at first glance, as if it hadn't been polished in decades. But as Emily wiped the dust away, she was struck by how perfectly it captured the room. Everything, down to the smallest detail. It was almost too perfect, as if the mirror was not just reflecting what was, but what had been. That night, Emily went to bed with a strange sense of unease, though she chalked it up to the unfamiliarity of the new object in her home. She closed her eyes, attempting to sleep, but there was something unsettling about the quietness of her apartment. The mirror, though it was facing the hallway, felt present, as if it were watching her. Hours passed, and Emily was woken by a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a whisper coming from the hallway. She opened her eyes and sat up in bed, listening intently. it was gone. But the feeling of being watched lingered. Reluctantly, she got up and tiptoed toward the hallway, drawn by the inexplicable urge to check the mirror. As she peered into the glass, she expected to see the reflection of her empty hallway. Instead, she saw something else. A figure, a shadowy silhouette, stood at the other end of the hallway, just out of view. At first, Emily thought it was her own reflection, maybe her mind playing tricks on her. But as she blinked, the figure didn't move with her. It remained still, unmoving. A cold shiver ran through her body as she stepped back, the unease growing. It was then that she realized something even more disturbing. The figure was not just standing in the hallway, but was also staring directly at her. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, dark and hollow, like empty sockets. The reflection didn't match the physical reality of the hallway. Something was wrong, very wrong. Heart pounding, she reached out to touch the mirror, half expecting it to break or shatter under her fingertips. But when her hand met the cold glass, the figure in the reflection moved with her, its head turning slightly as if acknowledging her presence. Her hand jerked back, and she stumbled away from the mirror, the oppressive feeling of being watched pressing in from all sides. The next day, Emily was more on edge than. She tried to tell herself it was all in her head. Perhaps it was just a trick of the light or a momentary lapse in her perception. But deep down, she knew something had shifted. Something was wrong with the mirror. That afternoon, she decided to call her best friend Sarah to come over. Emily hoped that a familiar presence would ease her nerves, but even Sarah was taken aback by the mirror. She stood in front of it, gazing into the reflection, and then turned to Emily with a puzzled expression. "Emily, is this mirror supposed to reflect everything perfectly?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with "Yeah, I think so. Why?" Emily replied, feeling a tight knot in her stomach. "I don't know," Sarah said, eyes narrowing. "It just feels off, like it's showing more than it should." Sarah's words struck a chord with Emily. They both stared into the mirror, but this time, they saw something else. In the reflection, the hallway seemed darker, as if the light was dimmer, the shadows deeper. And then, in the corner of the glass, they saw it. A figure standing still, just like the one Emily had seen the night before. But this time, it wasn't a shadow. It was flesh, a man, pale and gaunt, his face twisted in a grotesque grin. Emily gasped and stepped back, her heart hammering in her chest. But Sarah didn't move. She was transfixed, her eyes locked on the figure in the reflection. "Sarah, don't look at it!" Emily shouted. But Sarah didn't respond. She was silent, her expression blank, her pupils dilated as if in a trance. In the reflection, the figure raised its hand, slowly reaching out towards Sarah. Emily grabbed Sarah's arm, yanking her away from the mirror, but it was like pulling her from a dream. Sarah stumbled backward, breaking the trance. "Did you see that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. "That thing in the mirror?" "Yes," Emily replied, her voice trembling. It's not just a reflection. It's something else. Something alive." The two women backed away from them, unable to take their eyes off the dark figure that seemed to move ever so slightly with each passing moment. It was like it was waiting, watching, anticipating, and every time they glanced back, the figure's grin seemed wider, more sinister. That night, Emily tried to sleep, but the sounds of soft whispers kept drifting through the apartment, muffled but persistent. Her mind kept returning to the mirror, to the shadowy figure that seemed to stare back at her on the other side. It was like the glass had become a window into something far darker, something trapped within. Around midnight, the whispers grew louder, now accompanied by the sound of scratching, sharp, frantic noises coming from the mirror. Emily bolted upright in bed, heart racing. She couldn't stay here. The mirror was no longer just an object. It was something alive, something with a mind of its own. She couldn't shake the feeling that the figure wasn't just watching her. It was waiting for her to come closer. And the longer she stayed, the more that pull seemed to grow, like a magnetic force drawing her toward the glass. With trembling hands, she grabbed a blanket and rushed out of the apartment. She didn't care where she was, just as long as it was far from the mirror. The figure in it, its hollow eyes, its ever-growing grin, had become too real, too dangerous. But as Emily walked out into the cold night, she couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was following her. In every reflection, in every window, she could see it. The pale man, always watching, always waiting. And no matter how far she went, no matter how many mirrors she passed, she could never escape its gaze. The reflection was always there, waiting for the day she would finally come back to it. Maggie had always loved the wood, the quiet stillness, the scent of pine in the air. The way the sunlight filtered through the trees, it was a place where she felt at peace, away from the hustle and bustle of the world. She often ventured out to the woods behind her family's cabin to clear her mind, to find a moment of solitude. But on this particular day, something felt different. It was late afternoon when Maggie decided to take her usual walk through the woods. The weather was crisp, the kind of cool autumn evening that made the leaves rustle underfoot. As she walked deeper into the forest, the sounds of the world seemed to fade away. The chatter of birds, the scurry of small animals, the rustling of the wind through the branches, all seemed muted, as if the forest itself had fallen silent. Maggie shrugged off the odd feeling, chalking it up to the isolation of the woods. She'd been walking here alone for years, and it was nothing out of the ordinary. But as she ventured further, she began to notice something unsettling. The trees were too still. No movement, no wind, just the eerie silence pressing in around her. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself, quickening her pace. The path, usually well-trodden and easy to follow, now seemed to wind aimlessly, twisting in unnatural directions. The sunlight, which had once been so warm and inviting, now seemed distant, its rays failing to penetrate the thick canopy above. The deeper she walked, the darker it grew. Then, she heard it, a faint whisper, like a breeze through the leaves, but it wasn't the wind. It was a voice, low, hushed, almost as if someone was speaking just out of earshot. "Maggie!" She froze. The voice had called her name, unmistakably. Her heart began to race. She glanced around, trying to locate the source of the sound, but saw nothing. No one. The woods were as empty as they had been. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the strange sensation that crept up her spine. It was probably just an animal, a bird, or the wind carrying sounds through the trees. "Maggie." The voice came again, closer this time, and this time it sounded more insistent, more familiar. It was almost as though the trees themselves were speaking to, whispering her name from deep within the forest. Her breath quickened, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Maggie, come closer." Against her better judgment, she took a step forward, her feet moving almost on their own. It was as if someone was pulling her deeper into the forest, urging her to follow the whisper. The path seemed to disappear completely now, the trees growing denser and closer together. Her surroundings were becoming unfamiliar, and the once quiet forest now felt alive with an oppressive weight. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the temperature seemed to drop. Maggie shivered, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but the voice, the whisper, kept calling her forward. Just a little farther, and then she saw it. Through the thick trees, just beyond her reach, stood a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a large stone circle, its stones weathered and worn by years of age. The moment Maggie laid eyes on the stone circle, she felt a sudden compulsion to step inside. Something about it called to her, a magnetic pull that she couldn't resist. As she stepped into the circle, the air around her seemed to vibrate, as if the ground itself was alive. The whispering grew louder now, swirling around her in a disorienting cacophony, each voice melding into the next, until they all blurred together. She could no longer tell where one voice ended and another began. "Maggie, Maggie, come home." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a command, a demand. Suddenly, the trees around her seemed to bend, as if leaning in, closing in on her. The shadows deepened and the temperature plummeted. Maggie felt a cold hand brush her shoulder, and she spun around, but no one was there. The trees creaked and groaned, their limbs twisting unnaturally. The whispers had turned into frantic, unintelligible murmurs, a low, constant hum that seemed to come from all directions. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw something move in the corner of her eye, a figure barely visible, standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that stretched at odd angles, like the branches of the trees themselves. Its face was obscured, hidden behind a cloak of darkness, but Maggie could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, locked onto her. "Maggie!" the voice hissed, this time coming from the figure. "You shouldn't have come." The ground beneath her feet shifted and she stumbled, falling to her knees. The figure moved toward her with slow, deliberate steps, its presence smothering the air around her, suffocating her. As it came closer, Maggie could see its face, a face that was not a face at all, but a blank, featureless mask of pale skin. Its eyes were black, empty sockets, and its mouth stretched into a wide, jagged grin that seemed to swallow the light. She tried to scream, but the sound caught in her throat, choking her. The figure reached out with one elongated hand, its fingers like gnarled roots, and touched her arm. The touch was cold, colder than anything she had ever felt, and in that moment, the whispers exploded into a deafening roar. "Maggie! Maggie!" Maggie! The world around her began to spin, the trees blurring into one massive, unending wall of darkness. The figure's grin widened, and the voices grew louder, louder than anything she could bear. It was as if the forest itself was swallowing her whole, pulling her into its depths. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, everything stopped. Maggie opened her eyes, unsure of how much time had passed. The clearing was empty. The figure was gone. The whispers had faded to nothing. The trees, once twisted and alive with shadow, stood still and quiet, as if nothing had happened. She was alone, but the air felt thick, oppressive. She stumbled to her feet, her legs weak beneath her. She didn't know how, but somehow, she found her way back to the path. The woods had returned to their usual calm, and the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the ground. She didn't stop to look behind her. She didn't care to know if the figure was following. By the time she reached the cabin, the night had fully descended. The wind was picking up, rustling the trees outside. Maggie locked the door behind her and sat in the dark, heart racing, mind spinning with questions she couldn't answer. The whispers, however, didn't stop. They were in her mind now. They whispered her name. They called to her. And though she tried to ignore them, she knew deep down that she could never leave the woods. Not completely, because the woods were waiting for her. And the figure, with its pale, blank face, was still there, just beyond the edge of the trees, waiting for her to return. It was a snowstorm like no other, the kind that hit fast and without warning, leaving everything smothered beneath layers of thick, icy white. Marcus had been driving back from a late-night meeting, the roads slick with frost when the storm swept in. By the time he'd realized how severe it was, he was already too far from home. His usual route was now a blur of white, with no sign of the road ahead or behind. Panic set in as his headlights sliced through the snow, revealing nothing but a wall of white. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up, and his tires slid, almost sending him off the road. He cursed under his breath, grip tightening on the steering wheel. He wasn't even sure if he was still on the highway. That's when he saw it. A small, dim light up ahead, cutting through the storm like a beacon. He slowed down, squinting into the swirling snow, trying to make sense of what it was. As he drew closer, he realized it was a house, a cabin, isolated and tucked away in the middle of nowhere. It seemed too perfect, too convenient. With no other signs of life around for miles, it felt almost like a mirage. But Marcus was desperate. He couldn't risk driving any further. With the snow piling up, he had no choice but to pull into the driveway of the cabin. He hoped to find shelter until the storm passed. He parked his car and got out, cold biting into his skin immediately. He trudged toward the front door, knocking firmly 3 times, but there was no answer. He tried again, louder this time, and waited. Still nothing. He was about to leave when the door creaked open slightly, and a low voice drifted out from within. "Come in," it said, a whisper barely audible over the howling wind. Without thinking, Marcus stepped inside. The warmth of the cabin hit him like a wave, and he breathed a sigh of relief. The place was old, but cozy, filled with rustic furniture, wood paneling, and a faint smell of pine. There was a fire crackling in the stone fireplace, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. As he stood in the doorway, unsure of what to do, the figure of a man appeared in the doorway of a room just off the main living space. The man was tall, dressed in a thick woolen coat, with his face obscured by shadows. The moment he saw Marcus, his expression didn't change. He merely nodded toward a chair by the fire. "Sit. You're safe here," the man said in a calm, emotionless tone. Marcus hesitated. Something about the man's demeanor felt off, but the storm outside was relentless, and he was exhausted. He sat down, grateful for the warmth, but uneasy about his host. The man didn't speak again. He simply turned and retreated into the other room, leaving Marcus alone. As the minutes passed, Marcus tried to make himself comfortable, but the silence in the cabin was suffocating. Every few seconds, he thought he heard a soft creak, like footsteps, though he couldn't see anyone moving. The fire crackled loudly, but otherwise, it was eerily quiet. After what seemed like an eternity, the man returned, holding a small plate of food. It was a simple meal: soup, bread, and a cup of something warm. He set the plate down in front of Marcus, without a word, and sat across from him. Marcus felt an odd sense of discomfort as he reached for the food, but the man didn't take his eyes off him, his expression unreadable. As he ate, Marcus tried to break the silence. "Thank you for letting me in," his voice strained. "The storm's pretty bad out there. I wasn't sure if I'd make it." The man's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "It's a good thing you found your way here." "Yeah, I I wasn't sure if anyone lived here. I've never seen this place before. There are many things you don't know, the man replied cryptically. Marcus's curiosity was piqued. But before he could ask more, the man stood and turned toward the door once again. You should rest, he said, without a hint of warmth in his voice. The storm will last all night. Marcus didn't argue. He was tired, his body aching from the long drive and the stress of the storm. He got up from the chair and followed the man down a narrow hallway, past more rooms, until they reached a door at the far end of the cabin. The man opened the door, revealing a small, dimly lit bedroom. A single bed stood in the corner, covered in heavy woolen blankets. The air in the room was musty, the window covered in thick frost. The man gestured toward the bed. Sleep. Tomorrow you'll understand. With that, the man turned and left the room, the door clicking shut behind him. Marcus stood there for a moment, unsure of what to make of the situation. The house felt too still, too quiet. He wasn't used to being in such isolation, especially with someone so strange, but exhaustion had begun to take its toll, and he sank into the bed, pulling the covers around him. As he drifted off to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, not just in the room, but in the cabin. The sense of being watched never quite left him. Every so often, he thought he heard something moving outside the bedroom door, soft footsteps that would stop when he tried to listen more closely. But when he opened his eyes, there was nothing there. The next morning, Marcus woke to a strange silence. The storm outside had stopped, and the sunlight filtered through the frost-covered windows, casting a pale light on everything in the room. He rubbed his eyes and got out of bed, feeling stiff. But as he moved to open the door, something caught his attention. The hallway was different. The walls had grown darker, the floorboards creaking unnaturally beneath his feet. The door at the end of the hall, the one he had seen the man disappear through the night before, was now closed tight, with a strange red stain seeping under the crack. Confused, Marcus opened the door and stepped into the hallway. There was no one around, but the feeling of unease was overwhelming. He moved toward the kitchen, but as he passed a mirror on the wall, he froze. In the reflection, standing just behind him, was the man from the night before. But this time, his face was twisted in a grotesque grin, eyes wide open and filled with a malicious gleam. Marcus spun around, but there was no one there. He was alone in the house, or so it seemed. His heart pounded as he backed toward the front door, his hands trembling. But when he reached for the knob, he felt the cold, icy fingers of a hand on his shoulder. He whipped around, but no one was there. A voice, the same voice from the night before, whispered in his ear, sending a chill down his spine. You shouldn't have come. The door was now locked. The windows were shut tight, and the man, the visitor, was nowhere to be seen. Marcus was trapped in the cabin, with no way out. The storm outside was gone, but the nightmare inside was just beginning, and somewhere, in the darkness of the house, he could feel the presence of something far older, far darker than he could ever imagine, waiting to claim him. As the whispers grew louder, Marcus realized the terrible truth. The visitor was no mere man. It was something much worse, something that fed on the lost and stranded, something that had been waiting for him, for anyone to find its home. And now, Marcus was its newest guest. Sarah had always been fascinated by antiques. As a child, she would spend hours wandering through old shops, touching the relics of the past, imagining the stories they could tell. But one item, a mirror, had always eluded her. It wasn't just any mirror. It was the one item that seemed to draw her attention, no matter how many times she visited the shops. The blackened mirror, as it was known in hushed whispers among the antique dealers, had been said to have a cursed history. It was framed with intricately carved wood, dark and aged, with twisted patterns that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. Its glass was unlike any other, darker in hue, almost obsidian. There were rumors about the mirror, whispers that it had once belonged to a family who vanished without a trace, that anyone who stared into it long enough saw not just their reflection, but glimpses of the future, of things that were never meant to be seen. Sarah didn't believe in curses, not really. She was a skeptic, someone who loved history, who loved finding old, forgotten treasures to restore and display. But there was something about that mirror, the way it seemed to draw her in, as if it knew her, knew everything about her. One day, after years of seeing it in various shops and markets, she found it. It was tucked away in a corner of a small, dusty antique store she had never visited before. There it was, the blackened mirror, sitting in silence, waiting. The moment she laid eyes on it, she knew she had to have it. She didn't hesitate, pulling out her wallet and paying for the mirror. the shopkeeper's eyes narrowing suspiciously as he handed it over. "You should be careful with that one," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah smiled, thinking he was simply playing into the superstitions surrounding the mirror. She thanked him and left, eager to get it home. When she set the mirror in her apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. There was a weight to it, a presence in the room that made her uneasy. She chalked it up to the excitement of acquiring something so unique. But as days passed, she began to notice odd things happening around the mirror. At night, when the apartment was quiet, she would hear faint scratching noises coming from the direction of the mirror. She would look, but the sound would stop as soon as she turned her head. Sometimes, she would catch her own reflection, shifting ever so slightly in the glass, her posture changing, her expression twisting into something darker. It wasn't her. It couldn't be. The first real incident happened one night when she was getting ready for bed. She stood before the mirror, brushing her hair, when she noticed something in the reflection. Behind her, in the dark corner of the room, a shadow, a figure that wasn't there in the room with her. She turned around quickly, but the corner was empty. Her heart began to race, and she looked back at the mirror. The shadow was still there, just behind her, but this time it was clearer, tall, thin, with long, bony arms that seemed to stretch unnaturally. The figure didn't move, but its eyes, those black, soulless eyes, locked onto hers through the mirror, and she froze. The reflection grinned. Sarah's blood ran cold. The grin stretched wider, impossibly wide, and she could hear a faint, raspy whisper coming from the glass. It was not in her ears, but in her mind. "Come closer." She stumbled back, knocking over a chair as she backed away from the mirror, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadow in the reflection didn't move, but its presence pressed on her, suffocating. It wanted her. It wanted something. She ran out of the room, slamming the door shut behind her, but the image of the shadow stayed with her, burned into her mind. She couldn't shake it. She tried to rationalize. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, a distortion in the glass. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. Over the next few days, the mirror began to change. The glass grew darker, the shadows deeper. The air around it grew cold, and the whispers grew louder. Each time Sarah looked into it, she saw not just her reflection, but something else. Visions of horrific events, of future tragedies that had yet to happen. Faces of strangers, twisted in pain, their eyes pleading for help, for release. But the worst part was when she saw hers. The mirror showed her own fate, but it was different. Older, sickly, eyes hollow, filled with terror. It was as though the mirror was trying to show her a future she couldn't escape. One night, unable to sleep, Sarah decided to confront the mirror. She stood in front of it, her hands shaking as she stared into the dark glass. The shadows were more pronounced now, swirling like smoke, and the figure from before, the tall, gaunt shape, was standing just behind her in the reflection, inches away. Its mouth opened, a gaping hole, and it spoke. "You will be mine, forever." The words chilled her to the bone, and for the first time, she felt a true terror that gripped her soul. She tried to turn away, to run, but her legs wouldn't move. It was as though something was holding her, keeping her in place. The figure reached out through the mirror, its long fingers stretching toward her, and she screamed. But the scream was swallowed by the darkness, by the twisted reflection. In that moment, she realized the horrible truth. The mirror didn't just show the future. It took it. It took the souls of those who stared too long, trapping them in the glass, in its endless, shifting nightmare. With a final, desperate effort, Sarah broke free from the mirror's hold, stumbling backward. She slammed her hand against the mirror, hoping to break it, but the glass didn't shatter. Instead, it rippled like water, the surface distorting under her touch, and she saw something she hadn't expected. Herself, reflected not in her room, but in the cold, blackened depths of the mirror, her eyes wide with terror. The shadow reached out again, and this time, its fingers brushed her skin. Sarah screamed as she was pulled toward the glass. The last thing she saw before she was swallowed by the darkness was her own face, grinning back at her from inside the mirror, twisted and broken. The blackened mirror sat silently in her apartment, its glass now even darker than before, and the whispers continued, soft, patient, waiting for the next person to come too close, to look into its depths for just a moment too long. And when they did, the mirror would claim them, as it always had, forever. Lena had always been a lover of winter, the quiet beauty of snow falling gently, the crisp air that seemed to clear her mind, and the stillness of a world blanketed in white. It was her favorite season. But that year, winter seemed different. It seemed colder. It all started with the house. Lena had recently moved to a small, isolated cottage in the countryside, far from the bustle of city life. She had dreamed of escaping to a place like this, where she could finally find peace, surrounded by the simplicity of nature. The cottage was old, charming in a way, with thick stone walls, a fireplace that crackled with warmth, and wooden floors that creaked with every step. It was perfect for her, or so she thought. The first night she spent there, the house seemed to settle into its usual quiet. But when she woke up the next morning, something was wrong. There was a faint, cold draft in the air, and the kitchen window was covered in frost. But it wasn't just the frost-formed patterns, unnatural, intricate designs that seemed to move if you stared at them long enough. Lena wiped the condensation off the window, trying to make sense of it. There, in the middle of the glass, was a handprint. But it wasn't from the outside, no. The frost had formed the handprint from within the house. The fingers were spread wide, the palm flat, as though someone had placed their hand there, pressing it against the glass. She shivered. It was unsettling, but she chalked it up to the house's age, maybe an air leak causing the strange frost formation. She didn't want to jump to conclusions. She had read stories about cold spots and mysterious drafts in old houses, but as she wiped the handprint away, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. That evening, as Lena prepared for bed, she noticed something strange. The light above the fireplace flickered for a moment, casting eerie shadows on the walls. She thought it was just a short in the wiring, but then the shadows moved. They were not the usual flickering shadows from the fire. No, these were different. Alive, shifting, stretching unnaturally. Her heart pounded in her chest as she quickly turned on every light in the house, hoping to dispel the darkness. But the shadows remained watching her, creeping along the walls. As she stood there, frozen, her eyes caught something in the corner of the room. A figure, standing just outside the light's reach. A figure that wasn't there a moment ago. She gasped, but when she looked again, the figure was gone. She forced herself to breathe deeply, convincing herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her in the dark. But that night, as she lay in bed, the frost on the windows grew thicker. It spread to the walls, creeping up the corners like a silent invader. And again, she saw it, the handprint. But this time, it wasn't just on the window. The frost had spread across the entire wall, forming the same handprint. But now it seemed to be moving. The fingers twitched, curling ever so slightly. A cold breath washed over Lena, and the temperature in the room plummeted. She could see her breath in the air. A soft, raspy whisper filled the room, so quiet she almost didn't hear it. "Let me in." Lena's blood ran cold. She bolted out of bed, her mind racing. She needed to get out of the house, but the door wouldn't open. The frost had sealed it shut. The windows were locked tight, the panes covered in a layer of ice that refused to break. Panic began to set in as she realized she was trapped. The whisper came louder this, "Let me in." The walls groaned as though something was pressing against them from the outside. The air felt thick, suffocating. Lena ran to the fireplace, grabbing a poker, her hands shaking. She searched the room for an escape, but everything was frozen, immovable, solid, and cold. Suddenly, the frost on the window cracked with a loud pop. Lena spun around, but there was no one there. The handprint, however, was still on the glass, and it was growing. It spread, the fingers elongating, reaching out to her as if trying to break through. The air was so cold now she could feel the sting of frostbite on her skin. In a moment of desperation, Lena ran to the attic, hoping to find an escape through the roof. But when she opened the attic door, she froze. There, in the center of the room, was the same handprint, this time etched into the wooden floorboards. The wood was cracked, splintered, and from within, she could hear the scraping of nails. Something was coming, something from beneath. Something. The air grew colder, the whispers louder, and the walls seemed to close in on her. Lena backed toward the window, the frost creeping up her legs, and in that moment, she understood the terrible truth. The house wasn't just cold, it was alive. Something had been trapped here for years, something ancient and hungry, and it wanted her. She glanced at the window one last time, and the handprint was now on the glass, clear as day. It was different now. It was no longer just a handprint. It was a face, pressed against the glass, with hollow eyes that stared directly into hers. The whisper came again, louder than before, filling her mind. "Let me in. I've been waiting for." Her scream echoed through the house, but it was swallowed by the cold. When the authorities arrived the next morning, they found the cottage abandoned. The door was wide open, the windows shattered, and the air inside was colder than it should have been, colder than the winter outside. There was no sign of Lena, no trace of where she had gone. Only the faint, frosty handprint remained, a warning for anyone who might enter next. And when the first snow fell, it covered the handprint. But if you looked closely, if you stared long enough, you could still see the outline, a reminder that the frost had once held something or someone in its cold grip. The cottage remained, abandoned and forgotten by most. But every winter when the snow fell, the handprint would return and the whispers would start again, waiting for the next soul to hear them. For years, Emily had heard the stories, the ones about the Howling Hollow. They spoke of strange occurrences, unexplainable events, and the eerie sounds that filled the forest during the long winter nights. As a child, she thought it was just folklore, tales passed down to keep kids from wandering too far from home. But now, as an adult, she found herself drawn to that very forest, determined to uncover the truth. Emily had recently moved to a small town at the edge of the wilderness, seeking solace from the chaos of city life. The locals often warned her to avoid the hollow, their eyes filled with unease whenever she mentioned it. But Emily was different. She didn't believe in ghost stories or superstition. She was a journalist, a skeptic by nature, and she wanted to know the real story behind the Howling Hollow. One crisp December afternoon, Emily packed her camera and ventured into the forest. The path was narrow, the trees towering overhead, their branches bare and reaching like twisted fingers. The ground was covered in snow, muffling her footsteps as she walked deeper into the woods. The air was sharp, biting her skin with every breath, but she pressed on, determined to reach the hollow. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It wasn't just the silence of the forest. There was something else, something more primal, a sense of unease that seemed to settle in her chest and tighten with each step. Eventually, she reached the edge of the hollow. It was a large, circular clearing, surrounded by trees so thick that the sky above was barely visible. The snow in the center of the clearing was undisturbed, as if no one had stepped there in years. But it was the sound that struck her first, the howling, a long, mournful wail, carried on the wind, reverberating through the trees. It sounded distant, almost otherworldly, and it sent a shiver down her spine. The howling echoed again, closer. Emily stood frozen, her breath visible in the cold air, her heart racing. She couldn't see anything in the clearing, but the sound was unmistakable. It was as if something was calling to her, drawing her in. She raised her camera, snapping pictures of the empty space, but there was nothing there. No creature, no figure, just the snow and the trees. Suddenly, the wind picked up, and the howling grew louder, sharper. It was no longer distant. It was right behind her. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Her pulse quickened, and she turned back toward the clearing. And that's when she saw it. At the far edge of the hollow, just beyond the tree line, something moved. A shadow, dark and shifting, standing still, but somehow wrong. It didn't have the shape of an animal or a person. It was taller than any man, and its limbs seemed to stretch unnaturally, twisting as if they didn't belong. The figure was obscured by the trees, but Emily could see its eyes, two glowing amber orbs, watching her with an intensity that froze her in place. The howling intensified, and Emily's fear took over. She turned to flee, but as she took a step, the snow beneath her feet cracked loudly, breaking the silence of the forest. The creature's head snapped in her direction, its glowing eyes narrowing. She could feel its gaze, heavy and predatory, pressing into her mind. She didn't dare look back. She ran, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The path through the woods seemed longer now, the trees closing in on her. The howling followed her, echoing in her ears, as if the creature were right behind her, but every time she glanced over her shoulder, there was nothing there. Only the empty, snow-covered forest. When she finally burst out of the woods, gasping for air, the howling stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. She turned to look back, but the forest was quiet, still. There was no sign of the creature, no trace of the haunting wail. Shaken and breathless, Emily made her way back to her cabin. She couldn't explain what had happened in the hollow, what she had seen, or what had chased her out of the woods. But she knew one thing. The stories were real. The Howling Hollow wasn't just a myth. Over the next few days, Emily tried to make sense of her experience. She reviewed the photographs she had taken in the clearing, hoping for some clue as to what had happened. But when she looked at the pictures, she saw nothing out of the ordinary. No creature, no figure, nothing that would explain the terror she had felt. It wasn't until she spoke to an elderly woman in town, one who had lived there her entire life, that she learned the truth. The woman's face grew pale as Emily mentioned the hollow. "You saw it, didn't you?" the woman asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The thing that haunts it's been there for generations. It's not just a creature, it's a curse. Those who enter the hollow never leave the same. Some never leave at all." The woman explained that the howling was the sound of the creature calling to those who were lost in the woods. It was said to be an ancient being, a spirit that fed on the fear of those who ventured too close to the hollow. Once it had its sights on someone, there was no escape. Emily couldn't believe it. She had thought the stories were just old superstitions, but now she wasn't so sure. She had felt it, the creature's presence, the weight of its gaze. And now, every time she closed her eyes, she could still hear the howling, lingering in the back of her mind like a distant echo. A week later, Emily packed up her things and left the town. She couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still watching her, waiting for her return. No matter where she went, she would never escape the howling. And in the quiet, cold nights of winter, when the wind picked up and the trees whispered their secrets, she would still hear it, the wailing call of the creature in the howling hollow, reaching for her always just out of sight, but never far enough to escape. Nina had always loved this. It was magical to her, the way it transformed the world into a quiet, serene wonderland, the way it coated the trees, the roofs of houses, and the sidewalks with a blanket of white, muffling all the noise and leaving only the soft crunch of footsteps. But that winter, snow became something else. It became a harbinger of horror. She had moved to a small mountain town to escape the fast-paced life of the city. The town was picturesque, nestled deep in the mountains, surrounded by dense forest. It was the kind of place where you could feel safe, at peace with nature. But after a month of living there, Nina began to feel something was off. It started with the snowfall. It came early that year, covering the town in a thick layer of snow, even before winter officially began. At first, Nina thought it was beautiful. She loved the sight of it, the way it blanketed everything in silence. But as the days went on, she began to notice something disturbing. The snow was too quiet. Usually, snow would make the air feel crisp, fresh, but this snow seemed to absorb sound. When Nina walked through the streets, it was as though the world had been swallowed up by an eerie silence. There were no birds chirping, no cars driving by. Not even the sound of her own breath seemed to escape her lips. It was as if the snow itself had muted the world. One evening as she walked home through the snow-covered streets, she felt the weight of the silence press in on her. The streetlights flickered in the distance, casting long, distorted shadows. Her footsteps crunched loudly in the quiet. But when she stopped to listen, the sound of the crunch seemed to fade almost immediately, as though the snow were swallowing it. Her heart began to race. Something wasn't right. She hurried back to her cabin, hoping to shake the uneasy feeling, but the silence seemed to follow her. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard it, a faint, low scraping sound, like nails dragging across ice. It was coming from outside. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. She waited, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. Thinking it was just the wind, Nina tried to go back to sleep, but the next night, the scraping returned. It was louder this time, a steady, rhythmic dragging, moving closer to her cabin. She lay in bed wide-eyed, unable to move, as the sound grew louder and louder, until it was right outside her window. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she held her breath, praying whatever it was would leave. The scraping stopped. Nina waited in the silence, but something was different this time. There was a presence outside her window, something waiting. Finally, with a deep breath, she gathered the courage to peer outside. The snow had covered the ground in a thick layer, undisturbed by footprints. But there, in the snow, just beyond the window, was something that made her blood run cold. A figure, tall, shadowed, and bent at an unnatural angle. Its limbs were long and thin, twisted at strange, impossible angles. It was covered in snow, its face hidden in the darkness, but its eyes glowed a pale blue, like ice reflecting the moonlight. Nina couldn't move. She couldn't scream. She could only stare at it as it stood there, unmoving, watching her with those glowing eyes. Her breath came in sharp, quick gasps as her mind screamed for her to run, but her body refused to obey. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. The snow outside the window was undisturbed, as if nothing had been there at all. Nina's heart raced in her chest, her limbs trembling uncontrollably. She quickly shut the curtains and backed away from the window. The next day, Nina tried to convince herself that she had imagined it. The stress of the move, the isolation of the cabin, maybe it had all gotten to her. But that night, the scraping returned. This time, it was louder, closer. And this time, it wasn't just scraping. It was a tapping, a soft, deliberate tapping, like fingers on glass. Nina's blood ran cold. She didn't want to look. She didn't want to know. But she knew she had to. Slowly, she pulled back the curtains and peered outside. The figure was there again. This time, it was standing at the edge of her porch, just inches from the window. The tapping continued, rhythmic and insistent, as if it were trying to get her attention. Its eyes, those glowing ice blue eyes, were fixed on hers. Nina's body finally responded. She stumbled backward, her legs giving out beneath her as she fell to the floor. She scrambled to her feet, desperate to escape. She rushed to the door, but it was locked. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so violently she couldn't get them into the lock. The tapping turned to a pounding, harsh and relentless. The window shook with each strike, and Nina could hear the thing dragging itself around the cabin, moving slowly, deliberately, as if it was savoring her fear. With a final burst of adrenaline, she managed to unlock the door and burst outside into the deep snow. The wind howled through the trees, but the silence, the unnatural, suffocating silence of the snow, remained. She ran through the forest, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but no matter how fast she ran, the snow seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in around her, and the thing with the glowing eyes, was still behind her. Nina never made it out of the woods. When the search party found her the next morning, they found nothing but a trail of footprints leading into the forest, disappearing into the thick snow. There was no sign of struggle, no sign of life, just the deep, unbroken silence of the snow. And then they heard it, the scraping, the tapping, the sound of something moving beneath the snow, something that had been waiting, listening for Nina to come too close. As the snow fell heavier that winter, the town began to whisper of the thing in the woods, and each time the snow fell, the tapping, the scraping, the sound of something watching from the silent depths of the snow would return, waiting for the next person to hear it, waiting for the next soul to be claimed by the silent snow.